think the theme we've kind of been going through a lot this morning is infrastructure automation, app automation. So I kind of want to follow on from the ServiceNow guys, the EMC guys, and talk about what a lot of customers say to me is what does it really mean? What does it really take to implement these things? You know, you hear about product lines from ServiceNow and EMC, but how do I actually do it? What does it take? And so I want to share some of that with you today. The very first thing, though, is areas of automation. You know, we talk a lot about provisioning, and it's a very important area. And let's not forget bare metal in that too. You know, we talk a lot about virtual provisioning, you know, application provisioning, but provisioning your infrastructure is also just as important. How do I scale out my ESXi hosts? How do I scale out Hyper-V hosts, et cetera? Very important. I'm going to talk a lot about virtual machines and application deployments because I think without the application, again, like you've always heard, none of this really makes sense. The other big area of automation is operations and maintenance, which often gets left behind. You know, we talk about how do I build a service. Well, how do I maintain that service as well? A lot of people have monitoring tools like SCOM, vCops, et cetera. And one of the big ones on that slide there is kind of self-healing data center. And you'll hear me talk about this quite a lot of vMugs, et cetera, is how do I have incidents that actually, you know, trigger workflows and correct my data center when things actually break. The other big thing is you're actually using a lot of automation today already. I mean, a lot of people here use vSphere, resource allocation, DRS. That's something you use today, and that's a form of automation already. vSphere HA, I mean, how did it used to be in the past to try and fail over a server with Microsoft clustering, et cetera? vSphere HA changed the game, so you're already using a lot of automation. And the other big one, and a lot of people thanked me for this, I think, at a TransUnion when I was there, and we started doing Catamaran, was automate your change control. It's the most annoying thing that people do in IT is writing change orders. You know, it takes like 30 minutes to fill one out and get it approved, et cetera. And if you can make your automation system also take care of your administrative tasks, that could actually be a bigger time saver than cloning your server itself. So it's something to think about. So coming back to the application, so I want to keep the focus there, is the life cycle of the application is key to all of this. And a lot of people go and they automate and they start with kind of the request, approval, and provision piece. So they're definitely important. You heard from like the ServiceNow team, you know, the request catalog is paramount to how do I request my service. But then also, how do you manage it? You know, once you've delivered this great server or great application to your standards, how do I keep it that way? How do I ensure configuration drift doesn't occur? And then finally, you know, retiring and archiving the application as well, the server. Sometimes dev, for example, you might not archive those production servers. As you retire them, you might choose to archive those services as well. So that's pretty key. Then the tools, right? You hear from the vendors all the time, I've got this great tool, I can build you a cloud, but what do they really mean and where do they fit? And these are kind of the categories that I like to put them in. Orchestration, I'll start there because I think that is the one that people don't focus on enough. They focus on too much on the cloud, the automation tool, but orchestration is really what connects everything together. And that's where you're going to find as IT managers, you have to kind of take, you know, members of your team and allocate them to work on learning orchestration, learning that new skill set, because it's very different. And there's plenty of tools in that space. ServiceNow actually overlaps both, for example. It does front-end self-service and orchestration. And then once you've built these back-end, you know, pieces, like how do I get everything to connect together, if you don't present it in a front-end web page or, you know, and talk about it in your town halls, like this is how I get my ServiceNow. I go to ServiceNow, or I go to vCloud Automation Center, or in some cases, you may just build a custom web page. You need to do that to really make the request catalog available to people. And then configuration management, which, you know, is a whole topic in itself, but there's a lot of tools, and people ask me all the time when I go to customers now, what's going on with Puppet, what's going on with Chef, et cetera. Targets. Now, I think this is a great discussion because private versus public cloud doesn't change the fact that you still need to think about your tools and the problem of deploying a service. So a lot of people sort of say, okay, well, I'm going to go to public cloud. That means, you know, I'm worried about my job now. My IT engineer, he's not going to have a job anymore to deploy anything. I think your job gets more complicated. I think, you know, Amazon Web Services means, okay, maybe I deploy a server, but maybe I don't deploy a 3-tier app. I might use a relational database service that Amazon offers and use a web service and only deploy the app server. So I think it creates a lot more questions that have to be answered. This is a great report example from VCAC, for example, and this is how we think the management tools have to evolve, is to really show you, and we didn't put the actual costs in there, we didn't want to show which one was cheaper than the other, but you know, dollar amounts associated to what does it cost to run this VM, this application in my private cloud? Well, what if I took it and moved it to Amazon? What's the cost to run it at that point? And these are the kind of reports that you should demand from the vendors and the tools that you get in. Again, all I really care about is the app, and I talked to a lot of architects when I was at Catamaran. It's like, if we're building all these orchestrated workflows and all these things to install .NET Framework, install WebSphere, for example, at what point can I stop building Visio diagrams in my design sessions and just drag and drop those pieces into an interface and create an application blueprint, if you will, that then gets rolled out to my private cloud, my public cloud, whatever my target may be. And the screenshot you're seeing there is actually from vCloud App Director, and I'd say that's kind of the last place in the maturity model, but it's a great way to kind of deploy applications. Don't forget platform as a service offerings. I think that's the other key thing, talking about Amazon, don't always assume I have to deploy a 3-tier application again. So always keep those in mind whenever you're building these blueprints. Multiple ways to achieve the desired outcome. The example on the left actually is how we did it at Catamaran, is ServiceNow, vCenter Orchestrator, and Puppet. vCenter Orchestrator was a free tool, came with your vCenter license. We built tons and tons of workflows there. ServiceNow was used as the front end, and then Puppet was in development to kind of keep those configurations maintained. And then on the right, you can see, what if I put VCAC in? Suddenly the diagram gets much more complicated. But I think you've got to demand, again, when you're looking at all the pieces, is what is it going to look like if I add something new in there? Because you don't want to go into VCAC. The IT engineers might want to go into VCAC to manage their servers and workloads. The requester is going to want to look at everything in ServiceNow, and he's not going to want to go to a Puppet dashboard. So they've all got to be able to present information to each other and coexist together. Orchestration. Again, here we talk about it more and more all the time. We still feel like this is the key. This is the glue that absolutely connects everything together. And one of the things people worry about is, well, I've got so many orchestration tools now. I've got NetApp Workflow Automation. I've got vCenter Orchestrator, Microsoft System Center Orchestrator. It's not actually a problem unless you get too many, but they can all talk to each other. So example I use of your storage team, NetApp has a fantastic workflow automation suite, and your storage guys can go and build their workflows to provision data stores inside the NetApp workflow automation tool. And then the IT team, the server team can say, okay, I'll just use your workflow that you built in your NetApp software and call it from vCenter Orchestrator. They all use something called SOAP or REST, which you may or may not have heard about, and that's how all these tools communicate together. Whiteboard. Some people remember this slide. So, we talk about this at the VMUG a lot, is don't just go into the automation tool and start working. You really kind of need to sit down and plan everything out. And the way we think about the approach for building IT services is more like this, right? Number one is prioritize. Decide what are actually your bottlenecks and where are you actually going to save your time. I mentioned change control could be the first one you go after, for example. So talk to the project managers and say, where is actually the bottleneck in the time to deploy a service or application? And then that's the first one you're going to go after. The second phase is standardize. Don't even start coding again until you know what does the end state need to actually look like. So in the case of a Windows server, sit down with your Windows team and say, what should be installed? Should I be using a VMXNet 3 driver? Should I be using paravirtual controllers, et cetera? And come up with that Windows standard and document it, and then program everything based around that standard. So step 3, create procedures. That's where you actually decide, how am I going to get to that end state? How would I do it manually? And I don't mean clicking in a GUI. I mean actually, what are the things I would type in the command line? So if I'm installing a CCM agent as part of my Windows builds, what's the CCM setup.exe and all the flags, et cetera, I have to put in there and write that down basically before you get anywhere. Step 4, finally, you can start automating. You can have some fun, you can play in the tool, and actually take all those scripts and code them and put them in there. And then publish. I mentioned again, it's all great if it's sitting in an orchestration tool, but if nobody can actually see it, it's pointless. It's got to get in your request catalog. It's got to get into ServiceNow, VCAC, whatever your request catalog might be. So this is an example of an early IT services catalog. And this was just some brainstorming we did with a few engineers. Well, what are the things that we get requests for a lot? Adding CPU to servers and adding memory to servers was pretty common. And I was like, well, why don't we just create a workflow? VCO has a partially built-in workflow to add CPUs to a server, so just go ahead and create that. But the more interesting thing that we found was when we decided to provision and deploy a Windows server using vCenter Orchestrator, we actually had to build all the other workflows in light blue anyway in order to build the whole Windows server build process. So take those workflows that you just built as sub-workflows of your Windows build process and present them as services. So in order to deploy a Windows server, you decided, okay, I need to work on my IPAM system. I need to find a way to create a workflow that gets an IP address and plugs it into a server. Well, how many days do you get IP address requests anyway, not related to server builds? So take that workflow, publish it by itself. Same with backup configuration. We had a lot of discussion on this. Think of everything as a menu of options, right? What are the backup windows that I'm actually going to offer people? I might have a 7 p.m. window, a 10 p.m. window, and I built that as part of our Windows build process. It's in the request. You select your backup window from the beginning. Well, what if somebody wants to change their backup window? Now you've created a workflow anyway. You can present it in the front end and allow somebody to self-service change the backup window for their server. This is what it basically looks like when you kind of look in the tool from vCenter Orchestrator. And this is a screenshot from an early build on the Catamaran side, and a couple of people here from there. I encourage you to talk to them out here today, because they can tell you what it's like to do this real world, what the skills, adaptation was like, etc. And typically what we found was, you kind of have environment decisions at the beginning, like what data store does it go on, what ESX does it go on, what resource pool do I put things in, etc. Those are some of the initial questions that have to be answered. Then server name generation. For some reason, I did this at TransUnion and Catamaran. This causes the biggest debate amongst teams on how the server name should be. It causes a lot of arguments for some reason. But once you actually come out with it, that's a server name generator. It generates a server name, finds out what the next available number is, pings it, checks no one else is using it, etc. And then finally, at the end, you kind of get on to actually cloning the Windows server. All this decisioning is happening up front. And those are decisions that typically somebody would manually have to think through. Now you've just done all that engineering up front, so it's all taken care of for you. And then you kind of onto the blue section, which is post-clone workflows. We got install SCCM there, add a local AD security group, tag your VM, that could be add to CMDB, etc. Those will happen afterwards. And then at that point, we think it's kind of handed over to your configuration management system, whether it's Puppet, SCCM, etc. So what does it take to actually build a workflow? Again, sub-workflows should be used wherever possible, so they're reusable. But the goal, for example, you just start out with find the data store with the most free space in this example. So I'm decided I want a workflow that gives me the data store to put my VM on, because I don't want to go and look every time and find out which data store is the most free space, which one's the DR data store, etc. So the example I'll give you here is we use the storage DRS cluster, and we had clusters for DR, clusters for high I/O, clusters for low I/O, etc. Second workflow would go and list all the data stores in the pod. So you've put in some criteria. It's given you a pod of data stores. Now it's giving you the list of those data stores. Third one is actually calculate the free space. So this is kind of what the coding looks like, and we'll talk about the skill sets a little more in a minute. But for example, you pass a string from your service request tool. So this could be ServiceNow. It says somebody selected, I want something in the Chicago production data center. They've selected a checkbox that says, I want DR, for example. They select another checkbox that says they want high I/O. And then what vCenter Orchestrator would do, for example, is tell you that this VM needs to go in this pod. And then more JavaScript. We're not going to go into all this now. If you want to hear more about what the coding involves, we can talk about that at the booth. But I just want to kind of show people what the coding kind of looks like. And this is a JavaScript example that takes those data stores and calculates the free space. VCO plugins. So again, we're talking about coding. I want to spend a bit of time on this. Is wherever possible, don't code. I mean, there's a lot of vCenter Orchestrator plugins exist. A lot of people have PowerShell scripts that already exist. Those are all reusable. Actually going and doing JavaScript is kind of the last thing you do. It's kind of the step one would be use a plugin if it exists. And you can see there's tons of them out there already. Step two would be use PowerShell if you already have the script. And then step three would be code against the API. So skills and team required. So again, programming. I think I've seen this in two ways. Some people, from IT teams have a background in programming. Maybe they came from a WebSphere team, or maybe did a lot of Linux, etc. Other people have had no background in programming, and the learning curve is very different. It's kind of this right brain, left brain kind of discussion people have all the time. Is sometimes the person who doesn't have the programming experience can think through the business problem better, and sometimes the person with the programming experience, doesn't think of the bigger picture but can code the thing in 5 seconds, right? So that's definitely a difference. I think no matter what, you're going to find you have to kind of adapt your team to learn some programming. And the bigger part of that is really focus, right? They can't do it while they're firefighting. You can't do it if you're getting a walk up at your desk every 10 minutes. You need to close the laptop, or close Exchange at least, and close IM, and go down and work on a different floor in a meeting room or something, and get away from your desk. So, work across silos goes without saying. None of this is possible. If you can't talk to your storage team, you're not going to go anywhere. So I've seen it in two ways. I've seen a very open team, very people that wanted to just work together. I've seen the other way too, where it took director level buy-in to kind of just go to another director on another silo and say, make this happen, give this person access to automate it. I think there's always resistance to change, and I think you just got to manage it the best you can and get your leadership to buy into it. Everything has a standard, and there's a standard for everything. People are probably sick of me saying this. Actually, I got this from one of my mentors a while back, and I think this helps really guide how you build workflows. And anytime somebody asks for something, decide, okay, what's the standard for that? And then that helps you say, okay, I'm going to go and build a document, create that standard, and then is it worth taking that standard and actually automating it? If you're only going to do it one time a year, probably not. If you're going to repeatedly do this, then maybe it's time to offer it as a service. and challenge the old way. Just because you did something one way doesn't mean you should go and automate the old way. Don't assume the standards somebody's telling you about are actually correct. Feel free to challenge it. Say, how about we do this completely different? How about we change the way we present data stores? Was adding a 2 terabyte data store every time beneficial, or does it make sense to use things like TinTree where you just get one giant data store and you don't have to worry about automating that piece? So it adds a new dimension to it. So where to begin? I think leadership and automation go hand in hand. If you don't have buy-in from VPs across the stack, because it goes back to working across silos, you absolutely need everybody bought in on it. And really, if you can, get kind of a virtual team. If you will, get like a storage evangelist, get a VMware person, get a network person, people that are quite passionate, that really want to do it. Focus on the long-term goals of self-service. I'm talking a lot about automating, like choosing a data store. Don't forget the end goal, and that's to deliver the entire application. So, you might start this in your IT team, in your VMware team, it might grow from the app team. But let's say you grow it from your VMware team, you already need to be having those discussions with the app teams because they may be going and swiping credit cards and building things in AWS already. And you kind of need to just figure out, what's the best way for us both to come together and deliver these applications. And again, begin automating your basic IT services. Things like add in CPU, add in memory, provisioning Windows, Linux servers. Those things don't take too long to do. And if you get those done, then that just frees you up again to have more of those conversations about moving on to Puppet. How do I get more configuration management in place, etc. Empower others to automate. I think this is absolutely key. What you don't want is automation to turn into another silo. And I've seen that happen once before, and it's not great because then you just become another queue. Like somebody's now got to go in automation team queue in order to get things going. That's not to say you don't need governance, because you absolutely do. I mean, you need to work with your architecture teams, et cetera, to say, well, when does it make sense to use these tools? But teach other people how to do it. If you can teach your network engineer how to create a workflow that opens up a firewall rule, and he creates that workflow and maintains it, you can then reuse that workflow when you're deploying a 3-tier application. And the last thing now I really want to say is keep the message clear. It's not about saving time, but about improving the quality of service, because a lot of times people say, well, okay, how much time am I saving by automation? Is it 4 hours it used to take to build a server, now it's 30 minutes? That's great. You probably are saving a lot of time. When you deploy 1,000 servers a year, for example, that's an immense amount of time. But it's really the quality of the server that you actually delivered. I mean, you developed a standard for the server application, and every time you build it from your request catalog, the same thing is coming out every time. The amount of remediation efforts that go on to make sure agents were installed, backup windows were configured, hard drives were expanded per the request, those are the things that take more time. Right-clicking and cloning the VM is 5 minutes. We all know that. It's the other things that go on that really take the time. And the one thing I didn't touch on, we're busy building the AHEAD Aviation version 4 of our lab now. I mentioned the tools earlier, the kind of the ecosystem of tools. And the goal really, what we want to show is, well, how does it work if you've got ServiceNow and UCS Director and Chef? What does that look like? If you've got VCAC, vCenter, Orchestrator, and Puppet, what does that look like? And we have a lot of those tools already up and running. We want to evolve them even more and kind of just show everybody what you can actually do with this stuff. So thank you very much.